There's something people rarely understand about empaths. They think empaths are emotional, soft, forgiving, endlessly patient. And for a long time, that's true. Empaths will give chances that nobody else would give. They will stay in relationships long after they've been emotionally exhausted. They will try to understand people who never tried to understand them back. They will keep hoping, even after disappointment becomes a pattern. But what most people never realize is this. When an empath finally detaches, it's usually permanent. Not because they stopped caring, but because they cared for too long. And by the time they leave emotionally, they've already fought 1,000 silent battles inside themselves. Battles nobody saw. Battles they never talked about. Moments where they questioned their worth, their patience, and how much more pain they could carry before something inside them finally broke. That's the psychology people fail to understand. Because empaths don't suddenly wake up and stop loving someone. Their detachment happens slowly, quietly, painfully. It happens after repeated emotional wounds, repeated disappointments, and repeated moments of feeling emotionally unseen. And once that emotional cord finally breaks, it rarely reconnects the same way again. In this video, we're going to explore the deep psychology behind why empaths detach permanently, what pushes them to that point, and why their silence afterward is often more final than anger could ever be. What makes empaths different? Empaths experience emotional energy differently from most people. They don't just hear emotions, they absorb them. They walk into a room and instantly feel tension without anyone saying a word. They notice emotional shifts most people ignore. They can sense sadness hidden behind fake smiles, discomfort hidden behind forced laughter, and emotional pain hidden behind silence. Because of this heightened emotional awareness, empaths naturally become caregivers. They become the listener, the fixer, the emotional support system everyone leans on during difficult times. People often feel safe around empaths because empaths make others feel emotionally understood. And many times, they understand people on a level deeper than words. But here's the dangerous part. Empaths often confuse understanding someone with tolerating unhealthy behavior from them. Because they see pain behind people's actions, they make excuses. He's hurt. She's been through a lot. They don't mean it. They're struggling internally. So instead of protecting themselves, they overextend themselves emotionally. Again and again. They give energy when they're already exhausted. They offer compassion while silently falling apart themselves. And over time, this creates a psychological imbalance. The empath becomes emotionally responsible for everyone else, while nobody becomes emotionally responsible for the empath. That imbalance slowly destroys them internally, because constantly carrying other people's emotional weight eventually becomes unbearable. Why empaths stay too long? One of the biggest psychological traits of empaths is emotional endurance. They can survive emotional pain longer than most people, not because they're weak, but because they believe people can change. That hope keeps them attached far beyond their breaking point. While other people leave after repeated disrespect, empaths stay and try to heal the situation. They replay conversations in their minds. They analyze behavior deeply. They search for hidden wounds in the other person, believing that if they can just understand the pain deeply enough, maybe they can finally fix the relationship too. And because they naturally feel empathy so intensely, they struggle to give up on people, especially people they once loved deeply. This is why many empaths become trapped in emotionally draining relationships for years. They don't leave when the first red flag appears. They stay, they adapt, they forgive. They keep convincing themselves that things will eventually improve, until slowly, forgiveness turns into self-abandonment. And psychologically, that's where the damage begins. Because every time an empath ignores their own emotional needs to save someone else, they teach themselves that their pain matters less. Over time, they stop prioritizing their own emotional well-being altogether. And eventually, exhaustion replaces compassion. And that exhaustion changes them forever. Because even the deepest empathy cannot survive endless emotional depletion. Emotional exhaustion changes the empath. People think empaths are endlessly emotional, but severe emotional exhaustion actually creates emotional numbness. This is something many people misunderstand. When an empath reaches their limit, they don't always explode emotionally. Sometimes they become frighteningly calm, because the emotional system has been overloaded for too long. After constantly absorbing stress, conflict, disappointment, and emotional pain, the mind eventually stops reacting the same way. Their mind begins protecting itself psychologically. And this is where permanent detachment often starts, not with anger, but with exhaustion. The empath stops arguing, stops explaining, stops begging to be understood. They stop chasing conversations that never lead anywhere. They stop trying to fix problems alone. And people often misread this silence. They think, oh, they're finally okay. Maybe they stopped caring. But internally, the empath is shutting down emotionally. The attachment is weakening little by little. Their nervous system becomes tired of emotional chaos, tired of unpredictability, tired of carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry alone. And eventually, their brain makes a survival decision. This connection is hurting me more than helping me. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath begins associating someone with emotional exhaustion instead of emotional safety, detachment no longer feels painful. It starts feeling necessary. The turning point. Every empath has a turning point. A moment where something inside them quietly breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but silently, deeply, permanently. And interestingly, it's usually not the biggest betrayal. It's the final repetition, the final disappointment. The moment they realize nothing is changing no matter how much patience, understanding, or love they continue to give. Psychologically, repeated emotional disappointment creates emotional detachment over time. The empath starts recognizing patterns instead of promises. They stop getting emotionally distracted by temporary apologies or empty words. They stop listening to words and start believing behavior. That's when clarity begins replacing emotional attachment. The illusion disappears. And once an empath truly sees someone clearly, it becomes very difficult for them to emotionally reconnect the same way again. Because empaths love deeply, but they also remember deeply. They remember every time they were emotionally abandoned while trying to hold everything together. Every moment they stayed loyal while feeling emotionally alone. Every time they silenced their own pain just to keep the relationship alive. And eventually they ask themselves one painful question. Why am I fighting so hard for people who would never fight this hard for me? That question becomes the beginning of emotional freedom. Because once an empath realizes their love is being taken for granted, detachment stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like self-respect. Silent detachment begins. One of the most misunderstood things about empaths is how quietly they detach. They don't always announce it. They don't always seek revenge. They don't always create dramatic endings. Many empaths emotionally leave long before they physically leave. They begin observing instead of reacting. The emotional investment slowly fades. Conversations become shorter. Energy becomes distant. Their emotional availability disappears little by little. And because empaths spent so long trying to save the relationship, once they stop trying, it usually means they've already reached emotional burnout. At this stage, they're no longer looking for temporary fixes. They're no longer hoping another conversation will magically change everything. They're looking for peace. That's why their detachment often shocks people. because outsiders only notice the final stage. They don't see the months or years of internal suffering that came before it. They don't see the sleepless nights, the emotional overthinking, the silent heartbreak, or the countless times the empath tried to repair things privately. To everyone else, it looks sudden. But to the empath, the relationship ended emotionally a long time ago. By the time they finally detach, they've already grieved the connection internally. And once an empath reaches that stage, their silence becomes more powerful than any argument ever could. Why empaths stop explaining themselves? There comes a point where an empath realizes explaining their pain repeatedly changes nothing. And psychologically, repeated invalidation creates emotional withdrawal. At first, empaths communicate constantly. They explain their feelings carefully. They try to create understanding. They try to solve problems peacefully. They choose calm conversations over conflict because deep down, they genuinely want emotional connection, not emotional control. But when their emotions continue getting dismissed, ignored, or minimized, they slowly stop speaking. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer believe they're being heard. After a while, constantly explaining pain becomes emotionally exhausting, especially when the other person only listens long enough to defend themselves instead of truly understanding. This is one of the saddest stages of empath detachment, the silence. Because once an empath stops trying to make you understand them, they're already emotionally leaving. The long paragraphs disappear. The emotional openness fades. The effort becomes smaller and smaller until eventually, the connection itself starts dying quietly. And by the time they fully detach, they've usually accepted a painful truth. Some people only appreciate empathy after they lose access to it. That realization changes the empath deeply. Because they finally understand that being emotionally available for everyone does not guarantee they'll be emotionally valued in return. The psychology behind permanent detachment. So why is empath detachment often permanent? Because deep emotional pain changes emotional memory. The human brain naturally avoids environments associated with repeated emotional suffering, and empaths feel emotional pain intensely. Once they connect someone to chronic emotional exhaustion, their nervous system begins associating that person with danger instead of comfort. What once felt emotionally safe slowly begins feeling emotionally draining. This creates emotional self-protection, even if the empath still cares. That's the important part people misunderstand. Detachment does not always mean the love disappeared. Sometimes the love remains. Sometimes the empath still thinks about the person, still remembers the connection, and still feels emotional attachment deep inside. But the nervous system can no longer survive the pain attached to it. Because after enough emotional damage, the brain stops focusing on love alone. It starts focusing on survival. And eventually, self-preservation becomes stronger than emotional attachment. That's why many empaths leave quietly and never come back. Not because they wanted to stop loving someone, but because staying was destroying them psychologically. At some point, they realize love should not constantly require emotional suffering. And once an empath finally understands that peace is more important than emotional chaos, they stop fighting to hold on to connections that continuously break them internally. Why they rarely return. Empaths give more chances than most people ever realize. So when they finally walk away permanently, it's rarely impulsive. It usually means they've mentally revisited the relationship hundreds of times already. They've analyzed everything, every memory, every betrayal, every excuse, every moment where they ignored their own intuition just to keep the connection alive a little longer. And once they finally detach emotionally, returning feels like betraying themselves. Because healing taught them something important. Love without respect destroys empathy. And many empaths eventually understand that constantly saving others while abandoning themselves is not kindness. it's self-destruction. That realization transforms them permanently. After enough pain, empaths stop seeing unconditional love as strength and start seeing boundaries as survival. They begin understanding that protecting their peace is not selfish, it's necessary. That's why their return becomes unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. Because the version of them that tolerated everything no longer exists. The emotionally exhausted version that ignored red flags, accepted bare minimum effort, and kept sacrificing themselves for emotionally unavailable people, slowly disappears during the healing process. And once an empath rebuilds their self-worth, they rarely go back to environments that once destroyed their emotional stability. Because at that point, leaving no longer feels like losing someone else. It feels like finally finding themselves again. The deepest truth about empaths is this: they don't detach because they never cared. They detach because they cared too much for too long. People often mistake an empath's patience for weakness, but what they fail to realize is that empaths are constantly absorbing emotional weight internally. They carry unspoken tension, emotional pain, disappointment, and the feelings of others, often while silently neglecting themselves in the process. And eventually, even the softest hearts reach a limit. The frightening thing about empath detachment is not the anger, it's the absence of it, the calm, the silence, the emotional distance. Because once an empath finally chooses peace over attachment, they rarely look back. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of survival. By that stage, they've already spent countless nights overthinking, trying to fix things, blaming themselves, and hoping the connection would finally become emotionally safe again. And maybe that's the real psychology behind permanent detachment. An empath doesn't leave when they stop loving you. They leave when they finally start loving themselves too. When they finally realize that empathy should never require self-destruction, that love should not constantly feel emotionally painful, and that protecting their peace is not selfish, it's necessary. Because sometimes the hardest thing an empath ever learns is that walking away can also be an act of self-respect.